So as you all know, Bernie Sanders supporters joined together in a class action lawsuit to sue the DNC, alleging that they defrauded Bernie Sanders supporters because, according to the DNC's own charter, they are supposed to remain neutral. The DNC chair, in fact, is supposed to remain neutral. However, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, under her tenure, she created rules that disproportionately favored Hillary Clinton to the detriment of Bernie Sanders and all of Hillary Clinton's opponents. So what the plaintiffs in this case are alleging is that by donating to a candidate in a flawed, rigged, unfair primary process that the DNC organization claimed was fair was an act of fraud. Now, after this lawsuit was announced, the DNC quickly filed a motion to dismiss this case altogether. Now, the first hearing was set for this last week to determine whether or not the DNC could get this motion to dismiss approved by a judge. Now, this is what attorney Jared Beck had to say, who was arguing on behalf of Bernie Sanders supporters.
We're very encouraged by the hearing because his questions demonstrated, in our view, an understanding of the claims that we're alleging in this case. I think we had a very, I think our positions are very, very strong on the law, and I think that came through at the hearing itself. Now, at this point, the court is going to go back and prepare an order, a formal written order on the motion that was filed by the DNC, and that order is going to contain the decision on the DNC's request to have the case thrown out, and it's also going to contain the legal reasoning and principles behind the judge's decision. And he did indicate that it's going to take some time for the court to draft and finalize that order because of the number and significance of the issues involved in the case. I'm very pleased with the hearing that we had and the opportunity to explain our position. We were given the entire afternoon was reserved for the hearing, and it went even beyond 5 o'clock. So for a motion in a case, that's a significant amount of time for a court to devote to the hearing, and that is something that we're happy about because it reflects what it is in our view, the importance and the significance of this case for American democracy.
So the fact that this motion to just dismiss the case went on for so long, it went on for 5 hours, that's actually a good sign that the judge is taking the gravity of this case seriously. Now, throughout the course of the hearing, the DNC stooped to a new low, and what they did was honestly something that should embarrass the DNC forever. So they literally put forth an argument to defend the DNC that is the antithesis of democracy. And again, let me remind you, the name of the Democratic Party is the Democratic Party. Democracy is literally in their name, but the lawyers put forth an anti-democratic argument to justify their decision to rig the primary.
Well, at one point, the defense lawyers proclaimed in open court on the record in response to one of the judge's questions that if the defendant's counsel's language, DNC lawyers' language, but he said that, if the DNC wanted to, they could go into a back room and smoke cigars and pick the candidate over cigars. I think he said like they do in the old days, and that there would be no repercussions for that from a legal standpoint. And to me, and I made this point to the court in my closing argument, that's a really sad statement when the representative of the Democratic Party's leadership organization, the leadership of the DNC, comes into court and actually says that we can rig the elections in this country and you, the people, have nothing you can do about that. To me, that is a sad thing because it spells the end of democracy in America. And as I put it to the court, I think it puts us on a very, very dark path.
Now, that wasn't the first time that the DNC's lawyers actually put forth this argument. In fact, they argued before that, you know, Bernie Sanders supporters weren't actually defrauded because we knew that the primary was rigged in advance. But the problem is that that's a legally dubious argument because according to Article 5, Section 4 of the DNC's own charter, it mandates, quote, in particularly as they apply to the preparation and conduct of the presidential nomination process, the chairperson shall exercise impartiality and even-handedness as between the presidential candidates and campaigns. And then, if that wasn't enough, Debbie Wasserman Schultz is on record insisting that the DNC was in fact neutral.
Well, first of all, let me just reiterate again that the Democratic National Committee is neutral when it comes to this primary.
But she wasn't neutral. The DNC wasn't neutral. And there's a name for that. It's called fraud. If you insist that the nomination process is fair, but it actually wasn't fair, as is now evidenced by the WikiLeaks release of DNC's and John Podesta's emails, then that's fraud. So anyone who donated to Bernie Sanders was in fact defrauded by the DNC, and that's basically the crux of the plaintiff's argument. Now, another reason why I found the DNC's lawyer's argument so absurd is because it's obviously undemocratic. I mean, I don't have to tell you that this is undemocratic. They're honestly saying that if they wanted to, they were entitled to have a bunch of bigwigs of the party sit behind closed doors with cigars and just outright choose the Democratic candidate. So in other words, they are literally arguing for a system that is like the Iranian election system where a bunch of mullahs get behind closed doors and pick who is acceptable to run in the presidential election. That is not acceptable, and they're shamelessly putting forth this argument, and it's part of the public record. That's not okay, and we're supposed to unite behind the DNC when we hear an argument from their attorneys like this. Now, the new DNC chair briefly admitted that the primary was rigged, but then he immediately retracted that statement, and there's since been no leader within the DNC or Democratic Party actually admit that the primary was in fact rigged, even though WikiLeaks gave us undeniable evidence that that was in fact the case. So the problem is that if no one within the Democratic Party's leadership and the DNC's leadership is willing to admit that the 2016 primary was rigged, well then they're most likely going to do it again if there's no accountability. But if you get accountability, if you admit that it was rigged, and we hold the people responsible for the rigging accountable, then it's not going to happen again. So since the DNC and the Democratic Party's leaders are unwilling to hold people accountable, Debbie Wasserman Schultz was promoted after she resigned in Hillary Clinton's campaign. She literally became the honorary co-chair on the same day that she was forced to resign in shame. She was promoted. So there's been no accountability, and this case is a way that we can finally get accountability. Now, the DNC has to pay up. It's the only way there can be justice. It's the only way that we can be guaranteed that it won't happen again, because if they have to pay a large price, if they're sued, then they're going to be a lot more reluctant to rig the primaries ever again. And it's not just because they may be paying a hefty price, it's because this would embarrass them forever. It would be a blemish on the party's history forever. Now, just how much restitution will be paid if we do win this case? Well, I'm going to share a clip from Nico House, who was there for the hearing.
This is a big deal, right? Which is why the news isn't covering it. This is why CNN and MSNBC isn't covering this. Like, I think a multi-million-dollar lawsuit for if the DC law statute is applied in this motion, which we'll know after the motion is, taken care of and concluded, this would be 3 times the restitution. This would be 3 times what we were originally suing for. So you're talking about like close to $400 million. Who's going to write that check for them? Who knows? $400 million. So the fact that they're not covering this shows a lot. It tells you a lot. It tells you what they're scared of. It tells you, it tells you that we're on the right track, because usually when they're not covering something, that's a big deal. it usually means we're doing the right thing.
So the DNC, they may have to pay big time because of their brazen attempt to undermine democracy and violate their own rules and violate the bylaws and the charter of the DNC. So they lied to us, they defrauded us, and they may now have to pay. Now, if they do in fact have to pay $400 million, that's chump change to them because one of their billionaire donors can foot the bill easily. But what they're mostly going to be paying for is just public humiliation. This will be embarrassing for them. Now, Nico also points out a really important point. He talks about how the media is refusing to cover this. They have no interest in covering this because this would be bad for the Democratic Party. It would be horrible for them. They would be ruined for a very long time and delegitimized for the next several elections. Now, thankfully, Nico is someone who I find as a great source of information, so I invited him on the show, and he's agreed to come on, so he will be answering my questions about the hearing, and mostly he's just going to give us the rundown, because he sat through all 5 hours of this hearing, and overall, he's giving us the impression that the judge does in fact seem fair and impartial. So, I feel good after this first hearing, but we'll talk with Nico and see what he has to say overall. But I mean, in the end, this DNC fraud lawsuit is incredibly important, and if you're wondering why you can't find information about it, and the details are scarce, it's because the mainstream media doesn't want to talk about this, because they don't want to make the Democratic Party look bad, because if you make the party look bad, you in turn make their donors look bad, and that's not acceptable when you live in an oligarchy. So, let's hope it goes through.
Support this podcast by joining the independent progressive media revolution today at humanistreport.com.